Are you ready now?
My name is Bob Geisert, Robert Geisert. I'm called Bob by all the people, so I'm always known by the name of Bob. And I live in Oregon, Ohio, which is outside of Toledo, Ohio. My hometown. It's been in my hometown for my whole life. Uh, I was 21 years old when I joined the service, and I joined it in Ohio. I was 21 on the 29th of June, and I got married on the 11th of July, and I was inducted in the service in the Air Force on the 29th of July of 1942. My training was in the Southeast Training Command. I started out by reporting into Fort Hays, Columbus. From there I went to Nashville, Tennessee for classification of a pilot. And the pilot training started at Montgomery, Alabama, in what they call pre-flight school. It was school in calisthenics and so forth to get you in condition to be a pilot. And from there I was sent to Riddle Flying School in Arcadia, Florida, where I started my pilot training in a PT. Let me think for a minute. PT 37, is it? PT 17, I'm sorry. Twin engine airplane. I soloed after 8 hours, and from Arcadia I was sent to Bainbridge, Georgia, where we went through basic training, and then from basic training we went to Valdosta, Florida, where we went through our final training, and then graduated. I graduated on the 4th of November of 1942 as a second lieutenant, and I began my flying career as an officer. The training program for cadets at that time was based on a criteria of what happens in West Point, because you started in each one of your phases of training was started as an undergraduate, and you were harassed by an upperclassman at that time, and went through the program where you wear square meals and all this type of thing. Anyway, to get further down the line, I graduated, and we were sent home for 10 days after graduation, and from there we received orders to go to Salt Lake City, Utah, where they assembled the crews for the bomber training. And from Salt Lake City, after we got our crew assignment, we were sent to Mountain Home, Idaho for further what you call phase training, and from there to Tonopah, Nevada, where we had gunnery training and completed more of our training. And from there, when we finished that, we were sent to Hamilton Field, California, where we picked up a brand new B-24. My position at that time was a co-pilot. My pilot's name was Warren Rustad. The crew that I was assigned to in Salt Lake City consisted of Warren Rustad as a pilot, and Bob Geisert as a co-pilot, and John Bowen, B-O-W-N, as a bombardier, and Jimmy Kirrane, K-I-R-R-A-N-E, as a navigator. We were the 4 officers on the plane. The B-24 crew consists of 4 officers and 6 enlisted men. Okay, Uh, the enlisted men on the original crew were Harold Hale, H-A-L-E. He's a sergeant. He was our engineer. And Norman Reed, R-E-E-D, was our radio operator. Robert Weidenhofer, W-I-D-E-N-H-O-F-F-E-R, was our ball turret gunner. And P.J. Frankowick, F-R-A-N-K-O-W-I-C, was our nose turret gunner. And Frank Spano, S-P-A-N-O, was our waist gunner. And the other waist gunner was Ralph Lagrow, L-A-G-R-O-W. These were all sergeants, all flying personnel, non-com, or non... commissioned. Were all sergeants in the Air Force. Okay, we picked up our plane in Hamilton Field, California, and we flew it across the country to West Palm Beach, Florida. From there, we were sent to Guiana, Rio Grande, Natal, Brazil. We stopped on the way in Puerto Rico. We did it because we heard they had a lot of liquor there and silk stockings and leather products. So we drew straws to see who would get sick, and our navigator lost, and we landed there to put him in the hospital for examination while we went to the stores and bought all our supplies to take overseas, which consisted of a lot of liquor. And liquor at that time was a case of 100 proof Old Taylor was $48, $4 a bottle for a quart bottle. Okay, and then from there we took off from there. Then we went to South America, and from South America then we flew across the ocean at night to Dakar, Africa. And one of the things in Dakar, Africa that really surprised me was the fact that it was very, very hot there, and when we landed the plane, we were immediately surrounded by guards that were supposed to be guarding our aeroplane, and they were in full dress uniform, except they had bare feet, no shoes. They were walking around that hot gravel and asphalt composition on the ground, and I don't know how they could stand that heat, but they did. Anyway, we were there just a matter of a couple of days, I guess, and then got fueled up and so forth, and then we flew up the coast of Africa to Tunis, which is on the Mediterranean. And at Tunis, we were assigned to a replacement depot there, waiting orders, further orders to where we were to go. And on it had to be the 4th of April in 1943, we received orders to fly to the 719th the 719th Squadron, the 449th Bomb Group in Geisert, Italy, which we did. When we arrived that day, we found out that we were to be a replacement for 5 crews that were shot down that day. The 719th sent out 12 planes, and only 7 came back. And we were replacement for one of the crews. It was just a matter of 2 days later, after we arrived there, we flew our first mission as a group. On the 13th of April, we were to fly our second mission. On the 13th of April, I went down with the crew. We woke up in the morning and we went down, and I was down there at the plane ready to fly the mission, and a Lieutenant Kenneth Keeler, came up and told me that I wasn't flying that day. I wanted to know why, and he said, well, I'm replacing you and I'm going to check your crew out. and evidently Lieutenant Kaler was that was his assignment, to check new crews out and make sure that they knew what they had to do during combat. I turned around and went back up to my tent and took my flying clothes off and turned my parachute in and so forth. And the mission took off, and I waited. The mission came back. When the mission came back, the plane didn't come back. And I was told that they flew under another squadron at the bombing target. And one of the bombs from the squadron that was dropping bombs a little bit higher altitude than my crew was flying. One of the bombs hit the wing of the airplane and blew the wing off, and everybody went down in a tight spiral on fire, and nobody got out. They were all killed. And so when I got that news, I went down immediately to the enlisted men's tent to see what I could do down there to help out in the situation, and to recover some of the liquor that we had down in there, and everything was gone. It was all missing. Anyway, after that period, I flew extra for a number of times. I flew with the air officer of the day, which his assignment is to assemble the airplanes into flight formation for the bombing mission, and then we'd fly around and get all the planes in order, and then they took off for the mission while we would land again. I did that several times, and I also flew with a number of other crews as a replacement pilot until I finally got an assignment of a crew of my own. And the crew that I got, I was assigned to that crew was assigned to me because their pilot was on a physical disability. He was taken off of flying duty. And I understand part of it was because a good close friend of his was a navigator on one of the missions, and he took a direct hit in his head and was killed. And the pilot just didn't know how to handle the situation, and he just went fought, and they took him off of flying duty. Anyway, I got that crew, and I don't know exactly when we flew our first mission together, but it had to be somewhere around the first part of July. And I, at the time then, on the 14th of July, we were on our second mission together, and the target was Budapest, Hungary. And that's with our renewed crew that we had in there. And then I will name the crew that I flew with at the time that I was shot down, because I never come back to that mission. I thought that airplane was called Patches, but I found out later on it was called Ardal, I think it was. I'm not too sure what it is anymore. I have it written down somewhere, but I don't have it.
So your new crew, you can go ahead and talk about your new crew.
Okay. The crew that was assigned to me then, that I flew with on the second mission where I was shot down, was my co-pilot was Howard K. White, W-H-I-T-E. My navigator was Lawrence Heberle, H-E-B-E-R-L-E. My bombardier was Willis L. Engelhart, E-N-G-L-E-H-A-R-T. He was my bombardier. The gunners that I named, and I don't know the positions that they held, was David Hollowell, H-A-L-L-O-B-A-U-G-H, Robert Privet, P-R-E-V-I-T-S, Warren Woods, W-O-O-D-S, John Newland, N-O-O-N-A-N, Philip Gibson, G-I-B-S-A-N, and Arthur Lake, L-A-K-E. These were all the 6 enlisted men that flew with me. When we took off and headed for the target, I was flying in the bottom of a diamond formation. I was the bottom plane in there, and out over the Adriatic Ocean, the plane that was on my right, the waist gunner fired his guns, and when he fired his guns, the shells made a big, just a complete arc down, and I ran in right into him. I had no chance of even turning away from him. And at that time, they knocked out my front turret. The shells did. I didn't know any other damage or anything else, but we got the bombardier out of the turret, or the gunner out of the turret, and with the bombardier down in there, and got a new oxygen supply, and we kept on going because there's no reason why I should turn back. So we kept going. But just as we reached the IP, the initial point for our bombing runner, before we got to that, all of a sudden my #1 engine caught fire, and I tried to put the fire out with a fire extinguisher that's up above the windshield, and I couldn't put the fire out, and I couldn't feather the prop. The prop wanted to turn away from me, so I had to drop out of the formation because we couldn't keep up with the formation with 3 engines, and we were trailing a large plume of smoke behind us. And so I had everybody throw everything out of the airplane that we didn't need to lighten it up, to keep going. And about that time, we must have been hit by about 10 or 12 German fighters. And the fighters wounded part of my crew, and the fighters evidently caused the plane to blow up. And when the plane blew up, a big ball of fire committed the cockpit, and my face was burned and so forth. But at that time, it also blew a hole in the side, the co-pilot side of the cockpit, and for the 2 pilots to try to get out of an airplane, you got to go back through the flight deck. Well, we had this hole in the side of the airplane. So my co-pilot looked at me, and I looked at him, and I says, "Go!" And he went out, bailed out of that hole. I crawled across the console and across his seat, and I bailed out of that hole. And when I bailed out of the hole, at first, it was just, I tumbled, and I couldn't figure out what was happening. I pulled my parachute, and nothing happened. I had a backpack on, and I pulled it the second time, and it opened up. And when it opened up, I just like snapped open, and I hit the ground. I was that close to the ground, and it knocked me out. I felt my head going down between my legs, and it knocked me out for a little bit. And when I came to, I looked back at me, and I could see maybe a couple of parachutes way in the distance coming down. I also saw different piles of smoke here and there. The pieces of airplane that came down. So I set fields on fire in July. Your wheat fields and so forth were on fire. So I seen that. I gathered my parachute together, and I ran to a thicket and got into a thicket over there. And by the time I did that, they had, coming down the trail, not a wooden trail, but a dirt trail, was a farm wagon, flat farm wagon with about, I would say 5 or 6 farmers standing up on top of it. It was just a flat bed with pulled by horses, and they were racing towards these burning fields. And I stayed in there for a little while. When they went by me, then I followed the thicket around to across the road and into another thicket where I stayed for the rest of the day, just laying and trying to hide. Then I used to, from that point on, I started heading towards Yugoslavia. I figured I only chance to get back maybe with the partisans in Yugoslavia to get back home. And so for 6 nights and 7 days, I tried to get to Yugoslavia, and I had a lot of problems getting there. I'd hide out in the daytime in haystacks, or one time I laid in the middle of a cornfield all day. The main problem that I had was the fact that I didn't have any food or water with me. And food is second to water in demand. You really you got to have water. So I was drinking out of ditches and everything else just to get enough water once in a while and get a drink. Anyway, about the time of my sixth night or so, I decided that I wasn't gaining enough distance to, and so I started walking late morning, and I walked right into through the woods. I walked right into a man that was out in the woods carrying a shotgun, and he had a dog with him. And when he seen me and I seen him, why we went. I went in a different direction, and I went through a very big hedge, and I walked right into a little small village of probably a farm village that were in that area. Anyway, they gave me some food and water, and the guy was right behind me, and I was only there a short time, and a local patrolman, I suppose you'd call him, a man with a big fancy hat and plume on it and everything else. He showed up, and I wound up being chained in my hands together, and they hauled me into a prison that night. But to get back to my crew now, my co-pilot bailed out ahead of me, and when I got to POW camp, I kept looking out for him, and then he never showed up. And I found out that he was killed, and I think he was killed on the ground by the local people there, the farmers and so forth, that were pretty well disturbed by the fact that we set their fields on fire and so forth. The second member of my crew that was killed was my bombardier, and I figured that maybe that when the ship blew up, he was down in the nose of the turret and the nose of the plane, and he couldn't get out, and he went down with that part of the plane that crashed. The rest of the people, my navigator and my bomb and my gunners and so forth, had been bailed out as we went on our way down. Before the plane blew up, they had bailed out of the plane. So they were all POWs. I was a POW. My navigator was a POW, officers I'm talking about, and then the 6 enlisted men were all POWs. Now to get back to my trip, after they put me in a little local jail, the next day they chained my hands together and so my legs together, and they put me on a train with a lot of civilians and so forth, and hauled me into Budapest. I was shot down. Probably, I'm going to say, I have a location here, but I don't have referring to it here. The place that I was shot down, I couldn't begin to spell it out. It's in Hungarian. Anyway, they put me in this train and they took me into Budapest. And the first night in Budapest, I was in a jail there. I have no idea where it was, but I was interviewed then by, I assume they're Hungarian officers and we were German officers, and I got slapped around a little bit, and they threatened me, and they said that if I didn't tell them what they wanted to know, that the next morning they would take me out and shoot me. But I didn't know anything to begin with, so they had to shoot me anyway. Then I was moved from then. The next day I was moved into a prison uptown that it was down in the basement. And I'm assuming that it was German. And I think it was probably the German, what was the name of the German SOS?
SS officers? SS?
SS, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I think it was SS, yeah. Anyway, down in this location, I was put in this an old white cell with a real bright lights blurring, and everything was white. And I was down there. You had no idea whether it was morning or night or evening or what time of day it was or how many days you were down there. I have no idea how many days I was down there either. And finally, they put another guy in with me, and he supposedly was supposed to be a flying officer from some other group that was in there, and he said he was scared and he was going to tell them everything he wanted to know and everything else. And I think he was just a plant to get me to open up, because all I would give him was my name and rank and serial number. Anyway, they took him out then finally, and then they moved me out to another prison, which was a stone prison in Budapest. I've always wanted to go back to Budapest and see if I couldn't locate it, because I know it's still there. But it's a regular prison with like a big fortress. It's all stone, and I was in there for I don't know how long either. I was in there for maybe a week or 2 weeks. One of the things that we did in there, they served us kohlrabi. They'd chop it up and they'd put a little hot water with it in an aluminum bowl and hand it to you once a day. Maybe you did the kohlrabi, the bulb, you did one day. The next day you did the tops with the hot water. And anyway, we as in the flight crew, one of the things that we had to pass in our training was code, both oral code and
like Morse code?
Lighting code.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, we would write messages in code on that aluminum. We'd try to, if we could scratch it in there, we'd scratch it in there, so we try to get messages back and forth. But you didn't receive very much information that way. Anyway, I was moved in. I was taken out of there and put on the train and sent back to Squadron, Poland, where they kept the American officers. I don't recall much of my trip back at all, so I don't know why I don't recall whether I was doped up at the time or what it was, but I don't recall. I just can't remember that part of it. But I arrived I remember arriving in Squadron, and I was assigned to the center compound in Bergs 44 at Squadron. Squadron, it was in Poland, and there was all Air Force officers there. It was a camp, and that camp was almost, there was almost 10,000 American officers in this camp, flying officers shot down from various places in Germany and in Europe. I learned later on, after I went back to visit after the war was over, that there was also 6,000 Polish officers in this camp, right next to us. We were in different compounds. I was in the center compound, and they had an east compound, a south compound, a west, and a compound with British officers. And originally there was a British camp. And then when the Americans started flying over there and having such high losses, it became an American camp. Colonel Spivey was our commanding officer for most of the time, except that later on General Vandeman flew illegally in an airplane and supposedly got shot down, from what they tell us, and he wound up, and he was the commanding officer then because he was a general and over colonel. We were POWs in this camp. I don't know. I arrived sometime in August, I think, but I have no idea when it was, what the date was exactly. Turn it off for a second, can you?
Sure.
Prison camp. In prison camp, we lived in combines. They were wooden barracks, and we lived in combines of about 14 to 15 people apiece. We slept in beds that were 3 high, and when we originally arrived over there, they gave us 5 bedboards to lay across our beds in a sack that we filled with straw to be our mattress. Uh, in these combines, we combined our food and so forth. We were supposed to have a Red Cross parcel, one Red Cross parcel per man per week, and we were on reduced rations all the time I was over there of 1/2 parcel per man per week. Occasionally, the Germans would subsidize our food with some boiled potatoes, barley soup occasionally, and it just seemed like after a big air raid on Berlin that we would have some kind of stew of some type, where you would get the whole carcass of whatever dead animal was killed in the bombing raid. You'd get the teeth and the eyes and the ears and everything was all put in there, but we ate it because we were hungry. The Germans had what we call ferrets, F-E-R-R-E-T-S, and they were named after the animal that digs in the ground, because these ferrets would dig under the barracks and so forth to make sure that we weren't digging tunnels under there. And they had ferrets that were in the camp all the time during the day and at night. And at night they turned dogs loose in the camp, and we were locked into our barracks at that time. You could not leave the barracks. We at least every day the Germans would turn us all out for a head count, and usually they would take one of the barracks that was turned out, and they would go through that barracks. You weren't allowed to go back in that barracks that day. They would go through that barracks and tear everything apart looking for contraband material. So if it was your turn, why, you would stay outside all day long, no matter if it was cold and rainy or anything else, and you just couldn't go back in there until they completed their examination. As the war progressed, we kept getting information on an illegal radio that the British had in their compound. They would write messages over that they received on the radio, and they would throw it over the fence into our compound, and then we would pass it around, and we'd always put guards outside of a barracks, and then we'd call the people in the barracks together and read the information on there so we could get a little information. We knew when the invasion happened and this type of thing, to keep our spirits up, because you get awfully depressed in those places. Anyway, as the war progressed and everything else, when the Russians started getting closer and closer, we were forewarned that we may have to leave the camp, march out of the camp. And I understand that Hitler had given orders that no POW was to be evacuated. They were supposed to be killed, but the general of the Air Force and the German Air Force, and I can't think of his name right now, wouldn't put that order through, and so we evacuated. On March 27th, we first heard about our evacuation march, excuse me, around 9 p.m. at night. Originally, leaving time was set for 10:45, but later changed to 4 a.m. We started moving at 8 p.m. that following morning, and it was a blizzard outside. It was cold, down below zero, I think, and it was just blizzard and snowing and everything else. We marched all day in the cold, and that night we arrived at a town called Halabau, H-A-L-B-A-U, and our particular compound got assigned to a church. Excuse me. And the church wasn't big enough to handle all the people, so I was very fortunate. I was one of them that got inside of the church that night, and we piled in there, and we had people all over the place, but some of the people had to stay outside of the church, and they slept in different areas outside of the church. And then at the next day, the 29th, we started moving again at 8 a.m. and we marched 10 kilometers to a big barn where we were stationed for that night. It was a cold morning, it was blizzardy, snowing and everything else. We slept in the barn with no heater, no straw, and no German food. And we had 600 men to one barn. On the 30th, we marched again. The weather was still real bad, and we stayed in the barn that night, in a different kind of barn, with no heat or light, or food or any type. And then the following day, we were issued a partial part of an Red Cross parcel. We had one Red Cross parcel for 18 men. We just spread it around. No German rations. Although we had a lady to bring us some hot water that night, and boy, that was a godsend. On January 31st, we started the march again at 8:30 in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, and we marched 32 kilometers. Everybody had sore feet, blisters, frostbite, and so forth. But the weather has warmed up now, and it's getting kind of slushy out. March 2nd, we were in Moscow. When we went to a crockery factory, and we stayed in the crockery factory all night. And that was nice and warm in there because they had crockery kilns growing for their making crockery, and it kept it nice and warm. We were issued a quarter loaf of German bread at that time, black bread, and their black bread that they issued us was made of half sawdust, but it was still bread, and it was good. We ate it. On the February 1st, we stayed in the factory all day, and then February 2nd we stayed another day, and the snow was almost all gone by that time. And the Germans had issued a ration of 5/8 pounds of margarine and 1 tablespoon of cooked barley per man. And then we were issued Red Cross parcels of one parcel per 5 men. On January 3rd, we were awakened at 4:30 a.m. and we started moving. We marched 21 kilometers to Graustein, Graustein. We slept in a small barn in the farmhouse, and at that time we encountered an air raid, which lasted for almost an hour or so. At that time I got together with one of my prisoners, and we slept outside in a wagon. We crawled into the straw that was in the back of a wagon and slept outside all night long. We didn't go inside. We started marching again at 7 a.m. on February the 4th, and we went to Spremberg. And in Spremberg, we were put in a German garage, a great big long garage in there, where we slept on the floor of the garage for the night and so forth until they got a train located. And then the next day they put us in boxcars, and we had 50 men and 2 guards per boxcar. There was 50 men in a 48 French boxcar. You were so crowded you couldn't all lay down at the same time or anything. And our latrine was a bucket by the door of the boxcar. We were in the boxcar for 5 days before we arrived at Moosburg, which was outside of Munich, and that's Camp 7A. And at 7A is where the most of the prisoner of war camps were evacuated. During that time, they were all sent to 7A, and they were kind of congregated in there. When we first arrived there, we were put in a great big tent and just slept on the ground and in the tent. But then later on, we were moved into wooden barracks, but the barracks were extremely jammed. I mean, uh, they were sleeping in bunks, groups of bunks bed, which they were 3 high. 1, 2, 3, 4. I think there was 12 beds in one bunk bed in there. And then we were there until the time that Patton came through on the 29th of April and liberated us. We were sent from the camp then. We went into the Munich airport and we waited transportation there for a couple of days, sleeping on top of desk and so forth, and got a little bit of extra food, but not very much. And then when planes came in, they evacuated us and flew us into Le Havre, France, at Camp Lucky Strike. At Camp Lucky Strike, they marched you into camp, and when you got into the first tent that they had in there, they said strip, and they took all of our clothes off of us and put us in the showers and washed us up and just burned our clothes, I guess, afterwards, because we were full of lice and so forth and diseased. And so then from that point on, they took care of us. They issued us new clothing, a new uniform, and they had these big 30-some gallon garbage cans filled with vitamin pills. You could grab them by a handful and eat the whole vitamin if you went to. And the camp was set up that you could get any food anytime you wanted it. You could eat as much as you would. They recommended you didn't eat too much because you'd make you sick, but I don't remember exactly how long I was there. I was there probably 2 weeks at the most at this camp. Then they put us on a USS Lejeune, a troop transport, to come back home. The troop transport loaded up in Le Havre, France. We went over across the channel to England and picked up a bunch of wounded people over there. And then we got into a convoy with other ships, and we came home on the convoy the rest of the way. When come into Camp Lejeune, Camp New Jersey, Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, where we arrived. They were sent from there to different parts of the country, depending on where you were from. I was sent to camp in Indiana. Can't think anymore. And then from there, we got papers issued to us, and we were sent home. And I went back home. The one thing that happened, I couldn't believe it, but Camp Atterbury in Indiana. When we got there, it was around 7 o'clock at night. And of course, we'd been in the train all day long and no food or anything else. And they'd marched us down to the mess hall to give us some food. And the German prisoners who were working in that place, it was past their working hours, and they didn't want to come out and help prepare any food for us. And so we had some people in there that were pretty disturbed about that. And they finally showed up, and they prepared food, and we got some food to eat that night. And then we were processed through the various places in that camp, and then sent home for leave. And I arrived home. When did I arrive home? I can't think.
What was the total amount of time that you were a POW?
I was shot down the 14th of July, and I was liberated. Pardon?
1940.
1944. The 14th of July, and I arrived home when? Well, we were liberated the 29th of April when Patton came through our camp. And by the time that we were processed out of the camp, into Camp Lejeune, the Lucky Strike, and then come home on the troop transfer passport and everything else.
It must have been May, June.
It had to be around the 6th or 7th of June that I got back home.
Almost a year then.
And then I was home for a period of time, and we had to report back into the classification center in Texas. There's a Randolph Field. I can't think of the name of the place anymore.
San Antonio? Randolph?
Randolph Field, and where's that at?
San Antonio.
San Antonio. We were sent to San Antonio Classification Center, all the XPOWs for reclassification. And I was going to stay in the Air Force at that time. I decided to stay into it. And I was sent to Turner Field in Alabama for a refreshment course. I flew B-25s down there and so forth. And at that time, they had decided that any officer that stayed in the Air Force had to have a secondary job. And so I applied and it got accepted as one of 9 men that they take through a special training program for aircraft maintenance and testing, so forth, as a test pilot. And I was sent to Scottsdale, Illinois. When I got to Scottsdale, Illinois, I was married all this time, but I was in the service. I got to Scottsdale. My wife and I got to Scottsdale, Illinois. We couldn't find a place to live. We spent the night in the bus station, sleeping on the bench in the bus station. And the next day I went back out to camp where I was reporting to, and the guy said, "We don't have any of your papers here. We can't find them." I said, "Well, what does that mean?" He said, "We'll have to make some new papers out." I said, "Well, what if I don't want to sign the new papers?" He says, "Well, then you get out of the service." And I got out of the service. I changed my mind. Anyway, at that time though, rather than go get completely out of the service, I signed papers to stay as a standby reserve. And I was in the standby reserve from that point on until 1960 before I got an official release from the Air Corps by discharge. And so in 1960 I got the discharge, and that's it.
Just 2 minutes. Okay, so just the final thing, just a minute talk about what you thought about the B-24, since there was so much hype about the B-17.
The B-17 was a much more stable airplane to fly than the B-24 because it had bigger wings and so forth. The B-24 was had a Davis wing, and it was a faster airplane by 10 miles an hour than the B-17, and you had to fly it all the time. It wouldn't fly by itself, more or less. You couldn't get your controls set up so that it would fly by itself. You had to stay on top of it all the time. The other thing criticism I had about the B-24, it was all hydraulically operated. You had hydraulic lines all over the place. The B-17s didn't have hydraulic lines. And every time you got hit with a piece of flak and it cut a hydraulic line, you were leaking oil that could catch fire or burn and so forth. So I think the losses in the B-24s was much higher than the 17s because of that feature. I know we produced a lot more B-24s than B-17s, and our losses were much higher. I understand that the actual loss in that 71% of the people who flew combat missions in either B-17 or B-24, 71% never come back, never finish their missions. So it means your losses your chances of getting back were only 29% of the people. Anyway, I think that the Air Force really made a mistake when they designed the B-24 the way they did, because of the fact that it was so vulnerable to catching fire. So
Okay. Thank you so much.
that's about it.
That's great.